Welcome to the L36 Podcast, where the global exploration of cultural insights and stories of people making a difference big and small becomes the shift in perspective that makes us grow. I'm your host, Stephen Pearrce, founder of L36, with my co-host, Nina Winstead. And today we're speaking with Dr. Loren Toussaint, a distinguished psychologist, accomplished researcher, and a leading authority on the science and practice of forgiveness. With decades of experience as a professor at Luther College and director of the Laboratory for the Investigation of Mind, Body, and Spirit, Dr. Toussaint has profoundly impacted countless lives around the world. Today, he will share insights into the transformative power of forgiveness and its significant benefits for our health, emotional resilience, and societal harmony.
Welcome, Dr. Loren Toussaint.
Welcome. Thank you.
We are so eager to speak with you. And as we were doing our preparation for this episode of the podcast, I thought, man, forgiveness has turned out to be such a big topic. Let me go look at his research and see if it narrowed it down for me. And it didn't narrow it down. It broadened it. Studying forgiveness from cultures all the way from Trinidad and Tobago to Poland, from youth to the impact of forgiveness on one's health. You have really just explored the depths of forgiveness. And I thought maybe I can hone in on it a little bit by looking at his most recently published work. And it looks like it's been 3 months of the year and you've published 8 things. And then the prior year was more like 20.
That could be right. Yeah, I don't keep real close tabs, but yeah, that sounds possible. It's amazing.
It's amazing. So I would like you to maybe start off with just the most interesting question that I can think of right now is why forgiveness? Why dedicate so much of your time and energy and talent to the study of forgiveness?
That's a fantastic question. It's something I rarely ask myself. I don't need to ask that question because I can't think of anything more important to the world, frankly. And, honestly, about every time I think that maybe we've done as much as we can and, we're going to learn as much as we are, going to be able to learn, it feels like something else happens either in my personal, professional, or, broader world. And I think, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface, right? There's just so much to know just looking at, world history and looking at the faith traditions and histories that have held up forgiveness as a absolutely crucial value. This is not a new thing that we don't get along with each other, that we're not perfect, and we need a way to be able to move forward that is not absolutely just destructive. So yeah, I think the question of why forgiveness is a simple one. What else is more important, frankly?
Beautiful. Yes. So looking closely at some of the things that we were reading about your work, you have quite a bit that you studied around the impact of forgiveness on one's physiology. Can you talk a little bit about how forgiveness practices positively impact us physically, mentally, and emotionally?
Yeah, and before I do, let me add one thing to the previous answer, and that is to say, I don't believe that what I study is the most important thing just because I study it. There's probably any number of people you might talk to that have studied something for 25 years that would say it's the most important thing. There are lots of important things to know more about. Certainly, our ability to understand and treat horrendous diseases and other kinds of things are important too. I just think over the vast expanse of time, forgiveness is going to remain in that kind of probably top 5 category of the things that will allow us to move forward, successfully as a human people, I guess you might say.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say I didn't mean to come off arrogant about that, and I was thinking, maybe some would say, of course he says it's the most important thing. That's what he focuses on. So I don't want it to sound like that. I mean, of course, there's other things that are curious and interesting and fascinating. We should study all those things. But so the question that you just asked, which I should now get to, is about, what do we know about forgiveness as it comes to, our own kind of like, I often say like our own purely organic well-being. And certainly we toss about phrases like "you are what you eat," and that kind of makes some sense, even though we don't always get that message real clearly. Makes sense that the nutrients you put into your body are going to be the building blocks of what makes up your body, and it's not always that simple when it comes to something like forgiveness. People kind of, I think, stumble around a little bit, like, oh, what in the world, how would that have any impact? But the thing that has made the most sense to me over the amount of time that I've spent studying this question, all you really have to do is think about, and there's research that backs this up, all you really have to do is think about a time that you were, pretty significantly hurt. So something more than, somebody who, maybe treated you rudely in the parking lot or whatever, although some of those things can be fairly significant too. But, if you think about a time that, there was a fairly significant, so-and-so did this and then that happened, and boy, did I, that sent me reeling for a couple of weeks, and I didn't know what to do, didn't want to talk to them, those kinds of things. The moment you start thinking about it and reflecting on it, you start to feel it.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's, some people have described this as an embodied experience, both hatred and forgiveness in a general sense. Emotion in the broader class of things is an embodied experience, meaning that you are having this kind of ethereal emotional response, but it is very physically present in your basic organic structure. Your DNA is being impacted here. And so we tend to rely on just what we simply call a stress and coping model of forgiveness. And so the great thing about this is that I don't have to spend, a whole lot of time explaining that stress is bad for us. That's been known for 50 or more years. We know that when we get stressed about things, it does bad things to our mental health and our physical health and to our happiness. And things change dramatically, hormone structures and things, change in the body, and you have releases of adrenaline and cortisol and all kinds of things that do, great things if we're truly under significant physical threat. But today, most of the time, these things are happening in the absence of any real great physical threat. I'm just thinking about that thing that my coworker might have said 2 weeks ago. My heart starts to beat harder, my blood pressure goes up, it's readying me for a physical confrontation. And yet the worst thing that might happen is they might send me another email. It's just a completely maladaptive response at this point, an evolved response. At one point in time in human evolution, it was really a really good response. And today there are still moments in which it's a really good response. But because somebody said something hurtful to you doesn't mean you should get all stressed out physiologically about it. And yet we do. And so then the question becomes like, well, what's the best way of dealing with that thing? And of course, you could get all, bound up in this and just kind of feed and nurture the hatred that you have probably very carefully crafted. And we're just experts at that, right? You can come up with a story that just, it's impeccable about how you are an innocent bystander in this world and people just keep hurting you. But the other thing that you can do, you can do a variety of things. You could deny that it ever happened. Like, oh yeah, that wasn't a big deal. It didn't hurt me. It was nothing, You could minimize it. You could even condone it. It's like, well, I probably had it coming or whatever. These are all responses that, kind of in the moment, they might be all right. Sometimes it might be enough, to just say, all right, I had said some things too, probably had it coming. Let's just leave it where it is. But oftentimes you find that there's a thorn that remains stuck in your kind of emotional side. And that's where forgiveness comes in. And so I think of forgiveness, while it can be many things, at its core, I think it's really a response. It's a way of coping with hurt when it arrives. And I sometimes have people say, well, I just have never really been hurt so deeply that I would need to think about forgiveness. And, I might gently just say, just give it time.
Right.
I wish it were true that because you haven't been hurt deeply in the past, it means you won't be in the future. But most of us that have, enough years on this planet know that just because you've had kind of a charmed, life, maybe you've gone 30, 40 years even, or 50 or 60 years, it it doesn't mean that the future is always assured to be a painless one. And so, you get hurt. That hurtfulness is really stressful. And we know all the bad things that stress can do. And so forgiveness is, in my view, a really well-designed emotional coping strategy, a salve or a balm, you might say, for often, really kind of unfortunate wounds that hurt and have a tendency to come back and kind of fester and hurt a little bit more. It's probably one of the most productive ways. If I minimize it and say, oh, it wasn't that big a deal, later on, maybe it starts to feel like it was a bigger deal. But if I kind of try to forgive, I get past a lot of it in ways that are probably going to be better long term. So, and we've seen, all these benefits in mental health, in happiness, in physical health, in pain. And even one study that we did, we were able to show that people that were able to forgive a little more freely lived a little bit. They had a higher likelihood of living longer than those who kind of wanted to hang on to reasons to be unforgiving. So
yeah. But Loren, what is it about, or I guess I should say, Dr. Toussaint, what is it about forgiveness that changes that response? Like, what is the mechanism of action? How does it plug into changing the neurological pathways or the hormonal pathways? What is it about that?
Yeah, there's two things about forgiveness that are kind of interesting here. One is, sometimes people might have or might describe kind of a spontaneous forgiveness that just kind of washes over them at some point. Often this is kind of like a spiritual experience, but oftentimes, people have to really think about it. Like, do I really want to do this?
Yeah.
Is this something I'm committed to? And that probably has nothing to do with the neuroendocrine kind of physiological response. A decision is largely cognitive. It's, probably occurring in your frontal lobe somewhere in your brain. And you're committing to something like we do all the time. But, the other side of forgiveness is a really emotional side. And it's kind of a felt experience, something that you're not doing in kind of an icy cold, cognitive, calculated way. It might start that way, like you're thinking like, by golly, I'm going to have to, in some way, find a way to get over this and forgive and get on with my life. That's kind of a cognitive, but the emotional experience is one that oftentimes people describe as being like incredibly relieving, one that is just gives them a sense of relief in ways that they hadn't, found in other ways. The thing that we know about emotions is they are kind of the interface between brain and body, between nervous system responses and signaling and hormonal responses in the, periphery. It's really that the kind of emotional glue that is what's being impacted by forgiveness in its fullest bloom.
Yeah.
That is, you've decided on something. Maybe it took you days or weeks or months to get your emotions to catch up with your kind of commitment, your thought, your belief that you need to do this. But when you do, it's something that it just changes you in a way. It changes the way that your brain is kind of responding. It changes the way that the stress response is occurring in your body. And really, it's that emotional soothing. Many people in the last probably 25 or so years have started to emphasize the fact that we have a stress response, but we also have a relaxation response. They're largely independent. One can be activated without really troubling the other side. And forgiveness is one of those things that kind of triggers the relaxation response. It's a soothing response. It brings your nervous system back to more of a homeostatic state where you can, go about life in a more productive way because you're not turning every corner anticipating that you're going to have to blast that colleague because they hurt you 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And so I think that's really what it comes down to. It's the emotional side, the emotional processing of forgiveness that allows us to reap the benefits. It'd be nice if we could just think it, right? That would be ideal.
Yeah, right.
I think if we could just say, well, I've decided I want to forgive this person, and so I'll definitely feel better now. That would be great, right? That would be awesome.
Maybe there's an AI plugin for that somewhere in the future.
I mean, maybe it's the sort of, I suppose you could say, the sad irony of it is that, there's lots of debate about how long forgiveness should take, but the bottom line is that it's widely variable and seems to happen quickly for some people. It takes longer for others. And the one thing that I think we know is that there are no shortcuts. If it comes quickly, that's fantastic. But if you're trying to force it and move through it more quickly than maybe it feels right, it's probably not genuine, and it's probably not going to be terribly lasting. So I wish I could say, we found the perfect method. You can do it in 5 days and you'll be done,
Yeah.
I mean, at the rate that you work, we might have that here soon.
Right?
There's about, I don't want to take us in a direction that we're not ready to go here yet, but there's a couple decades, maybe 3 decades actually, of research looking at methods to help people forgive. And we have really good methods. There are now forgiveness therapy approaches. There are now kind of self-help, self-directed, evidence-based methods that myself and others have developed that we know work. They help people go in the direction that they want to go. It's still the case that I think no matter how much we do, no matter how much we kind of sharpen the edge of our forgiveness intervention, tools, so that we can cut right to the most important, most effective exercises and thought, practices, it still is something that's going to take work.
Yeah.
It takes effort. And that's the one thing that we know is that the people that are, and this might be, I think, perhaps this might be, a point of optimism for some people. The one thing we know is that the more time you put into it, the more likely you are to succeed. It's just that simple.
Wow. So that wave of emotional relief that you described, and I bet you described it that way because maybe you felt it, and many people that you've worked with described it as a wave of relief. When I imagine that, could it be something like when you are in pain, you learn to live with it so much that when the pain is finally gone, you realize that you were actually in pain? And with things like forgiveness, when I think about my most significant experience with a forgiveness practice was the realization that I was harboring something. Is that something that you noticed that maybe I saw that you work with people who suffer from musculoskeletal diseases and people who may not even realize that there is something to forgive at all?
I'd like to think I am better, more mature, and stronger than this, but I can still tell you some of the things that people said to me in middle school and high school that I did not like. And, that's a common point of confusion when I say things like this. People, I bristle at the idea that I'm some kind of forgiveness expert. I don't like that term. I'm a student like everybody else. And frankly, I'm not a very good one. I don't want to follow the advice that I give others, right? I don't want to do the things that I know that we've written in journal articles and in books and chapters and all over the place. We know things that are helpful. I think it's really, really hard to recognize just how many things we carry around that bother us, that it takes kind of a real commitment to living in a way that allows some of this stuff to either be forgiven kind of fairly readily, quickly, if you will, and to commit to working on the things that are going to take more effort. I think you're right. I don't think it's unique to me. If it is unique to me, well, then, I think this is not the first time I've said it and the whole world knows it, and that's okay, right? I'm very little trouble being honest with most things like this, but I think the bottom line is we all have these things that we carry around, and, various different analogies have been used, but, it's kind of like you're walking around with the sack. And every time you endure an insult, it's like taking another rock and throwing it in your sack. And pretty soon you're kind of like you're crumpling under the weight of this sack, and you've got so many rocks in there representing so many times that people have offended you or hurt you, either intentionally or not intentionally, in small ways, in significant ways. By, maybe by midlife or so, you're starting to feel like, oh my gosh, how am I ever going to drag all this around, right? That's the point at which I think a lot of people think there must be I must be missing something. And the something is often right in front of your face, right? It's like, what value are you getting from this holding on to all these things, right?
Not stronger muscles.
Yeah,
You're not getting stronger.
That's for sure. Yeah, you feel weighted down. There's one study that was done. I always find this fascinating, that they brought people to a hillside and had them stand at the bottom of the hill and estimate how steep the climb was in front of them by giving a number, like kind of like a geometry quiz, like what's the angle of the slope in front of you. And the people that were more forgiving estimated the hill to be a more shallow, more manageable climb.
Interesting.
The people that were less forgiving, kind of harboring more hurt and insult, and they anticipated it was going to be a steeper climb. I think that reflects the idea that, in some way it feels like, it's obviously the same climb for everybody, but the people that are struggling with forgiveness, they're carrying around such a load, it feels like a bigger deal. Whereas people who are, have a little bit lighter sack of hurts, they're kind of estimating that, yeah, that's not as steep as it looks. It has a way of impacting the way that you see the world. Another recent study was looking at kind of our perspective, and as we tend to forgive, we have a bit, it has a broadening impact, on our perspective. So we can kind of see things that we otherwise might have missed. So.
Wow, that's really interesting.
That is. And this may not have been discussed in the study, but those that said that the slope was a little bit less severe, were they more accurate?
My recollection is that the accuracy was kind of the secondary issue. The point was to really, how much of a burden do you see this as being? Yeah. So yeah, I don't know about accuracy.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it just generally, the idea though is that if we are more forgiving, we can look to all the challenges that we have in our lives and maybe ahead of us with a little bit more positivity.
Yeah.
And
so could you say that forgiveness builds resilience?
Yeah, we were kind of going in a good direction there. I was just about to say, I think it does build resilience. It's at least part of resilient people. Okay. If you define resilience as the ability to bounce back, what are we talking about here? I mean, bounce back is what you feel like you have to do when somebody smashes you to the ground by what they said or what they did, or their exclusion of you or their mistreatment of you in some way. That's kind of the definition of resilience, right? A simple definition of resilience is the ability to bounce back after, hurtful things have happened. And so, I think forgiveness is at least some part of resilience. It probably contributes to it, might help in the development of resilience. I think in large part, forgiveness is something that, kind of brings us an ability to be more hopeful, maybe a little more, optimistic, to expect good things to happen in the future. Some years ago, we learned that forgiveness was related not just to symptoms of depression, like we all have symptoms of depression. Some days they're more, some days they're less, but we learned that it was actually related to the diagnosis of depression. And this was not a clinician's diagnosis, but using a screening tool that allowed us to kind of infer these people are pretty likely to have a clinical diagnosis of depression. And sure enough, forgiveness was related to, a diagnosis, a likelihood of being diagnosed as being depressed. And we took it one step further, and we linked that to hope, and found that most of the reason why forgiveness was related to less risk of becoming depressed in a clinical state was because it reduced your levels of hopelessness. And when you lose hope, mental health is right behind you there. You start to feel hopeless about the world, and there's really no surprise that you become more depressed and anxious, and it's troubling. So
Wow.
Yeah, so I think the idea that forgiveness builds resilience, yes, I think it does. I think in large part because it helps you see the world in a better light, right? You don't feel like everything is lost when somebody hurts you. There's a way out of this. You have hope for a better future, even though this bad thing has happened.
That's fascinating.
It is. Can I ask you to talk a little bit about self-forgiveness? It looks like you've done quite a bit of work around that, and even into the religious, cultural, spiritual practices and what you've learned about self-forgiveness.
Yeah, so when you just say the word forgiveness, most people think about forgiving other people. And when you clarify that you're interested in self forgiveness, a lot of times people think, oh, that's probably quite similar because they both share the word forgiveness. And it turns out the similarities really kind of end with the word. there's there's
Nice.
forgiving other people and there's self-forgiveness, and they both share a term, but the process of getting there is almost entirely different.
Let's make it more complicated.
Yeah, right. So I should say there are similar benefits, although I can maybe come back to that. But self-forgiveness it's an interesting thing because I've had people that have hurt me. Earlier I mentioned middle school and high school, and the great thing about that is that I hardly ever see these people. I'm hardly ever reminded of them. So largely what they did kind of falls to the wayside. It's lost in the memory banks of my childhood, right? And we all, thank goodness that's the case for many of us, right? So that's a great thing. The problem with self-forgiveness is, during those years, I was also not perfect, and I did some really stupid things, and I remember those, and I can remind myself of those things pretty easily because I'm still me, right? So when it comes to forgiving other people, the great thing is that sometimes the people that hurt you leave your life, or they're, geographically or at least mentally very distant from you. They might not always have that kind of reminder of the hurt that they caused you. But when you goof up and you do things, you can't, most of us have not figured out a way to get away from ourselves. And so, the adages about, we're our own worst critics are really true, that, we're tend to be very self-critical. And so that's unfortunate because the self-forgiveness process is one that's hard to come to, largely because we can be really hard on ourselves. We feel ashamed of ourselves. We feel tremendous guilt. We kind of, lump a bunch of these things into something we call self-condemnation. And when you're condemning yourself, you're pretty much saying you're kind of a worthless person with no redeemable qualities, right? And that's really unfortunate. And it has all the same sort of negative effects of not forgiving other people. It's hard on your mental health and your physical health and so forth. Perhaps the biggest obstacle I might say is, it's hard to admit to the harm you've done. It's hard to own it. It's just hard to accept that you can be a good person who has done bad things.
Yeah.
And, that's really crucial, I think, especially in, a lot of professional circles, especially in healthcare, where the stakes often are really high. We can be really good people, well-intentioned, brilliant doctors, lawyers, professors. You can be a spectacular tradesperson. My brother is a fantastic electrician, and yet you can make mistakes and people can get hurt, and it's really hard to own that, to acknowledge it, and to just accept it. And the best illustration of that is that we've done things before where I teach a class on forgiveness, and I go into class and I say, like one of the first days of class, I say, how many of you have been hurt by somebody fairly significantly at some point in your life? In the past, these are college freshmen. And you would not believe how fast the hands shoot up. People are, yes, that's me. I have been hurt. Let me tell you about it. And then, a few weeks go by and we raise the issue of self-forgiveness. And but I start by asking, it's like, hey, I asked you a question a couple weeks ago about if you've been hurt. I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. Have you hurt other people? And oh boy, it's just amazing. People are sitting on their hands, they're looking at the floor, looking at the ceiling. No one wants to say anything because we don't want to admit that we're, good people that do bad things, right? It's just we're imperfect people and we hurt other folks. And so if you can accept it, you can probably find a way to do a number of things, like you might say, yeah, I'm broken in this way and I need I need help. I need to get past this. Some religious people might turn to their faith and think of ways that they can kind of atone for their wrongdoing. Other people might turn toward self-compassion and thinking about, how can I, recognize that I am my own worst critic. And if my best friend came and said, hey, I had a client or I had a patient or a student and they came in with these kinds of things and I did this and turns out it really was a disaster. And, if my best friend came in and told me this story, I'd probably say, hey, take it easy on yourself, right? You're human. We all make mistakes. You kind of course corrected, made the appropriate adjustments. They're probably going to be fine. But, any number of things that people might do turning to, that sort of approach, faith or compassion for yourself, or maybe you go to the person who you hurt and try to make it right. And there's lots of things that can happen once you accept that you're not a horrible person because you made a mistake. And then ultimately you hope that, eventually you kind of recognize you're a worthwhile person. You have in some ways probably recognized, hey, that was something I don't want to do again because I don't like hurting people. And so you kind of have probably adjusted your values and your goals. And, in that kind of light, hopefully you won't do this again. You probably can feel pretty good about yourself. But, self-forgiveness is something that I think I can't think of anyone who hasn't struggled with it, sometimes for the simplest of things, sometimes, for obviously, much bigger things.
Yeah, I think that was one of the, because I was the guy that went through medical training, and eventually when you're in the hospital, things happen, and you have to reflect back on your own decisions and the decision making that occurred, and some of them to this day haunt me, and they were the greatest education of probably my entire life, but they were also the most scarring events that occurred. And feeling responsible for somebody else's death is no easy thing to return from. And so, the forgiveness practice, I think that's what part of it, because that feeling responsible, or that sense of responsibility, triggered a whole other set of responses for me that I had to find my way back out of, specifically anxiety, which we were talking about with Fred Luskin about forgiveness just a few days ago. But yeah, but using forgiveness was really that path that let me go back to that moment and find some way to heal that. Because it's not like I can go back and talk to that person. They're no longer here. And so it's the forgiveness for myself was so incredible. That's why we want to, share people's work like yours, because I just think it's incredibly valuable. Pick your story that occurred in your life. I think everybody will have, hopefully not, but there are traumatic events that happen to people all day long. It's how do you return to who you feel like you are from after that happens. So
yeah, a glimpse into some unpublished data that we have. We're not quite ready. Coincidentally, I was just emailing with a student this morning about what we can do with this, but we looked at a bunch of factors that were potentially related to, PTSD-like symptoms, some of what I think you're describing, Stephen, as well as, experiences of moral injury and depression and anxiety and so forth. And we looked at a whole host of, various different kind of what we called risk and resilience factors. And we added, forgiveness variables into the resilience category. And this was in a smallish sample of surgeons that were practicing right around the COVID era. And what we're finding is that above and beyond many of the things that we would traditionally think would be important for, physician and healthcare provider mental health, things like compassion and empathy for patients, all these things are certainly important for the provider's mental health, but above and beyond all of those things, the impact of self-forgiveness is, I don't want to overestimate, but I think it's roughly about twice the size of the protective impact that you get from self-forgiveness. You carry a really weighty burden when you're in the circumstances that you're in healthcare. Things that you're describing, they weigh really heavily on people.
So self-forgiveness, the protective factor that it offers physicians is double any of the others that you measured.
Yeah, I'd have to go back, and I'm just kind of ballparking
Yeah.
right now, but yeah, I think that's in the ballpark.
So interesting.
Roughly twice the benefit, and that's not uncommon. We see
Mm.
that kind of in all different kinds of samples, that the impact of feeling like you've forgiven yourself has about twice the punch, twice the impact on mental health and well-being as forgiving others.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, when you said that, we just got this new unpublished data. We got like all twitchy. We're like, oh my gosh, you heard it here first on L36.
Right on the literal tip of the spear here. Yeah, yeah.
So cool.
So, but if you compare self-forgiveness to other mental well-being practices, are you able to compare those? Is it similar? I mean, because you mentioned it with surgeons, but it's similar with other people.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll just hop over. We're also working on a study similar, fairly small sample size, but about like 75 dental students. And yeah, in terms of comparison, in that study, we have things like perfectionism and rumination,
Mm.
Yes.
compassion, self-forgiveness, other forgiveness, forgiveness of situations. You would think, and for a long time, frankly, the research on kind of the mental health of healthcare providers has said that perfectionism, especially for dental students, is a really big concern. When I first came to that area of study, I said something very naive like, well, I don't know, is it really that big a deal that you're perfect in dentistry? And they said, I don't know. I mean, how would you feel if you came in with your front tooth knocked out? And we said, well, we fixed it halfway. Oh, yeah, I suppose perfectionism is like, I think the tendency is for,
Yeah.
but above and beyond even things like perfectionism, it's still self-forgiveness and, kind of more of what I think of as kind of an existential forgiveness of situations, really powerful stuff in terms of protecting mental health. And, for obvious reasons,
Yeah.
I think at this point, we're our own worst critics. And, I think it's also probably true that often in healthcare, there's people that offend you, sure, like every walk of life, but, it's that kind of exceedingly high bar that people in healthcare tend to have that
Yeah.
is probably hard to deal with.
We would love to be an arena for you to do more research. Because our hope is that forgiveness plays a big role in what we do and in the people that come and choose to be part of our community. And I would love to find a way to have research play into all of that. So if we get a big enough cohort,
Yeah.
we might reach back out to you
Yeah.
and let you know.
Yeah, but by all means, it's not difficult these days. I can send you
Yeah?
the link, and the channel would be established right there. Yeah,
Oh,
Oh,
interesting.
cool.
we're always looking for people. I'm particularly interested in healthcare and healthcare outcomes in
Yeah.
every kind of vast sense. And so yeah, that would be fantastic. I'd love that.
Yeah, that'd be
We
neat.
would be
Yeah,
happy to
really
do that.
cool.
Awesome.
Love it.
Well, I don't know. Let me just check the time real quick.
We have about 10 more minutes.
Okay, I was hoping that unless you had any other really pressing questions, I was hoping, because you touched on some methodology that is evidence-based.
Yeah.
I think we've done a really good job here of just talking about the critical importance of forgiveness, about the impact that it has on your mentality, your health. It sounds like some of the evidence that you gather from various research is that it's a very strong protective measure when it comes to your mental health. So what can we do? What are some of these methods?
Yeah, great. Thank you for asking that. So to start, if this is something, a method for dealing with being hurt, if we're talking about like super serious, life altering kinds of things, physical assault, sexual abuse, long-term ongoing emotional and verbal abuse, these are things that probably have to be, addressed in therapy. And
Yeah.
if forgiveness therapy is part of that, all the better. This could be a very long road, right? This could be months, maybe even years of work that needs to transpire. Thankfully, the definition of trauma is that it's something that people experience that is outside the realm of normal human experience. And so thankfully, traumas are kind of, by their very nature, fairly rare and affect, smaller groups of people. Not that that's not important, but so let me say, kind of add that disclaimer if I can at the outset to say, if it's really significant, you probably, if you're not already seeking help, you probably are going to need help with this. But there's a much more vast array of things that I would kind of lump into the kind of middle category. The middle category being things that happen that are hurtful that you remember, and they get you kind of tied up in knots when you think back on them. And that's where we've got lots of really good tools that you probably can manage some of it just with self-help if you know the right things to do. There is a brilliant website that is really easy to remember. It's discoverforgiveness.org. It is essentially kind of a clearinghouse for 30 years of research on forgiveness and its benefits and how to do it, and different ways of thinking about implementing it in different contexts, in the school setting, in the business setting, so on and so forth. That is just a fantastic resource. The Templeton World Charity Foundation has been involved in developing and kind of building that out.
They're involved in everything, I think.
Yeah, in many things, right?
Amazing.
Yeah,
it's incredible.
Right. Yeah, it is. They do fantastic work, and so I would be remiss not to encourage people who are thinking about, is there something I could do on my own here? Absolutely, there is. And I would start there. There's other, sources out there. I'm the president of the Forgiveness Foundation. We have a website, forgivenessfoundation.org. There's resources and, things and books and so forth available there that might be of use. I have been immensely blessed in my life and career that I've had these mentors and colleagues that have, never said no. They've always been helpful to me. People like Everett Worthington has a website where you can download all kinds of workbooks and toolkits to address forgiving other people. Self-forgiveness, you can do like a kind of a short version workbook, do it yourself kind of thing. Maybe 2-3 hours of time. You can do longer things. You can get instructions for if you have a group of people you want to get together, maybe a faith group or a community group that gets together. You want to lead kind of a group. He's got things that can help you lead a group on this, where you kind of benefit from not only going through the process yourself, but the social support that's available to you by having other people sit around and say, hey, that's happened to me too. And, Fred Luskin, who you mentioned earlier, another close friend and colleague who last 25 years has just been a shining star. And if you go to his website, learningtoforgive.com, I think it is, you'll get similar, arrays of resources and things that you can use and download and so forth and, read up on. I put a lot of this, I put into that middle category, right? It's hurtful. It happened. It upsets me, but I bet if I worked at it a little bit, I could probably get through it. And then, there's the other things that kind of, I don't want to say they're insignificant, but, when we think about stress and dealing with the world, there's kind of like the daily stresses that happen. And, if you don't sometimes address those, they kind of pile up.
Yeah.
And, a lot of those things I would probably say can be addressed in, like a forgiveness journal type of thing. A lot of people might have a prayer life or a meditation life, focusing on, a particular aspect of loving kindness meditation or forgiveness meditation.
Yeah.
Or, reflecting on holy scriptures in your faith that, provide good examples, all provide you with kind of, motivation. Look at these incredible people in the, in your faith that are held up as shining examples of forgiveness. And so, I kind of lump it into 3 categories. There's the really big stuff you probably need therapy for. There's a big chunk of this that's in the kind of middle of the road that you could probably get all the things I've just mentioned. You could probably get a lot of help, a lot of relief. And then there's these little things that probably shouldn't be ignored, or they even if you have a pebble a day, eventually it gets to be, a ton of rocks in your sack. So,
right.
But you can probably deal with those things, through lots of things like we're doing here today. You look up, look for a good podcast, look for a YouTube or something, keep a forgiveness journal. These are the things that I, kind of really irritated me in the last week that I'm going to work hard to just simply let go of and not harbor. So I'd say the method kind of depends on what's happened, but for most of us, I think a lot of it falls in that middle kind of category. Probably not going to forget it and probably need a little help. And that's where this kind of stuff is just really super. So.
Yeah, neat.
That's
Thank you
great.
for that.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to see if I just have time for one more question.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've been playing around with the sign out question.
Yeah.
And we'll have to see if it
survives.
If it survives. But I really want to know what people are working on right now, and you did kind of touch on it a lot earlier, but maybe it sounds like you're working on a lot of things. So I think when I read through your website, you had a beautiful quote about don't be so vain to study so many things and teach so many things. I'm going to misquote it, but just create a spark and a fire will catch. And so I want to know what is sparking your curiosity right now.
Yeah, that's great. It's not my quote. I forget who said that, but yeah, it's kind of a philosophy on teaching. Don't try to do everything. Just see if you can't kind of drop a spark and it'll catch fire. And for me, what's really fascinating is the same thing that was fascinating to me 25 years ago. I think we have just barely started to scratch the surface of understanding how forgiveness interfaces with so many different aspects of our lives. In particular, I think that we're kind of reaching a point where we're going to have to contend more with the notion that forgiveness, while we talk about it often as an individual process, a decision, and so forth, it happens in community. And you're hurt by others and you forgive others. You hurt others and they forgive you. And there's a lot of this that just happens in kind of a group dynamic. And if you think about the really significant groups in your life experience, probably one of the first and most significant groups is family, right? And we have to get better at understanding forgiveness in families, what makes for a forgiving family as they develop from a point at which maybe children are young, children are now adults, now parents are elderly and aged, and there's all kinds of things through the life course that create kind of unfortunate hot spots for families to be fragmented and fractured. And, many estimates are now suggesting that, somewhere between like 25% and maybe upwards of maybe 40, 50% of people are estranged from one member or at least one member of their family. Yeah. Given how crucial the family is to, successful development and support throughout life, we've got to get better at understanding this. The workplace is another place that I think of often. I've had challenges in the workplace, and when they have been significant, my first thought has been not how can I rectify this in a way that is the most pleasing to the organization. It's just the opposite. It's like, how can I rectify this to wreak the most harm and damage because I now hate them, right? And that's just not good business.
And it's not good health either, from what we've learned from you.
It's not good business. It's not good health. Right. I forget the exact numbers, but it's in the hundreds of billions that annually are lost because of conflict in the workplace. And I really should say that again. It's in the hundreds of billions of dollars that the U.S. economy loses every year, not over the great expanse of time, but every year.
That's crazy.
Hundreds of billions of dollars. I want to say it's like somewhere in the neighborhood of about like 350 billion that's lost due to the fact that people that we work with, we can't get along with one another. And what happens is I don't want to talk to you then. And everyone knows the phrase siloing and all these things. And it's just really hard to be in a workplace where people are sometimes kind of offending you or your department or offending your boss. And now I'm indirectly offended and so forth. We've got to get better at understanding how do we implement forgiveness more in the workplace. It should be considered a core soft skill, if you've heard that term, if people understand that. The hard skills are the things that you do that make the organization work and whatever, but the soft skills being these other things. So I think forgiveness is crucial in the development of our ability to continue to thrive as an economy. Then the last thing that I would say, the thing that is, kind of still sparking my interest is, we're talking today in the midst of lots of upheaval. I don't need to make anything political about our experience, but, there's just a lot of people that are really upset about a lot of things. And the question is not, how many things, how many on your scoreboard, how many marks can you tally up about how a certain side of the political persuasion or a certain aspect of the demographic of the nation or the community that you live in has offended you. There's no point in that, right? You keep tallying up. Okay, now they made this many mistakes. Well, who cares, right? We're all making mistakes. I mean, nobody's winning perfectly here. So, my question is, like, how do we take what we've learned about forgiveness, largely that has developed out of a kind of a discipline of psychology? It tends to be more focused on the individual. How do we take that and apply that in ways that can benefit the community, the nation, the global state that we're in? I have lots of colleagues around the globe that are asking me questions about what's going on, what does this all mean? And, I'm no political or economic expert. I don't know, but they're kind of asking me, and I need to find ways to bring unity. And I think forgiveness is one of those things. It might be the most powerful unifying force on the planet, right? That we just have to recognize that no one's perfect. We have to move past imperfections and try to set them aside and focus on what it is that we want to do. I think we're all kind of, generally speaking, we're all looking for the same things. We want to live happy, full, flourishing lives, right?
Well, it's funny, we had the mindfulness movement. Maybe we can get to the forgiveness movement.
Maybe, yeah. I hope for that. Your lips to God's ears, right? I mean, I think that's I think that would be a wonderful intention to hold, that maybe we will find ourselves in a place where there's no other way out, and we'll have to figure out ways to be a more forgiving people.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Loren Toussaint. Oh my gosh, what a wonderful conversation we've had with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been great. Thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us on the L36 Podcast, where stories and cultural wisdom ignite the transformations that help us grow. Today's powerful conversation with Dr. Loren Toussaint illuminated forgiveness as far more than an act of kindness. It's a potent pathway to health, resilience, and community healing. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it empowers our future, enhancing our emotional clarity, physical well-being, and collective harmony. Remember, the greatest journeys often begin with the simple choice to forgive ourselves, others, and the world around us. If this resonated with you, we'd be grateful if you'd subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who might benefit. These dialogues are just the start. To dive deeper into today's insights or explore the rich landscape of wisdom, community, and transformative events we offer, visit us at L36.io. Join our global family of adventurers, storytellers, and changemakers dedicated to personal and cultural growth. Stay connected by following us on social media. Until next time, keep exploring, keep growing, and we'll see you soon on the L36 Podcast.